With your look around the Air Force, I'm Senior Airman Angelo Rosadio. The Air Force has removed pilot height requirements. Previously, pilot applicants wanting to pursue a career in aviation had to meet a height requirement between 5 feet 4 inches and 6 feet 5 inches and have a sitting height of 34 to 40 inches. The change opens the door to a larger, more diverse pool of candidates. Previously, applicants needed height waivers if they didn't meet the standard, and most were approved under the old system. But the process still acted as a barrier to interested applicants. Medical and operations teams will use new screening processes that will allow pilot candidates to be placed in aircraft they can safely fly. Physical fitness testing for airmen is suspended until October 1, 2020 due to COVID-19 concerns. Lieutenant General Brian Kelly, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Manpower, Personnel and Services, says airmen will remain the top priority and that their health and safety are important. Local commanders will have the authority to postpone testing if fitness centers remain closed and local movement restrictions are still in effect beyond October. Once assessments resume, members will test on every component except for the abdominal circumference portion. Airmen will be exempt from the waist measurement until October 1, 2021. Airmen can visit the Air Force's Personnel Center website to find out more information and to view a detailed chart with instructions on when they can expect to take their next test. Every week starting June 2nd, 60 new recruits will begin basic military training at Keesler Air Force Base, Mississippi. Keesler was chosen as a secondary training location to provide relief to Joint Base San Antonio-Lackland's training infrastructure. Recruits may be selected based off the location of their technical school to limit the movement of airmen during the pandemic. Keesler is home to over 160 different career field training courses. And that's your look around the Air Force.
The light from a star can take millions of years to reach Earth. So when you look at a star, you're looking back in time. But I see the future. I see exploration and courage. I see my country finding new horizons out there. And I see giant leaps making a comeback. I see myself. The future is where I'll make history.
I think it's really important that everybody knows how the LGBTQ+ community fits into the workplace, and that there's a lot of stereotypes out there and not everybody fits those. We're just your fellow airmen that are serving side by side with you. Our strength is in our diversity. It absolutely shows that the more perspectives we bring to the workplace, the better solutions we find to a myriad of problems.
I'm Mr. Roger Hill. I'm the manager here at Peterson Air Force Base Fitness Center. I'm here to talk to you on Tuesday, Team Peace Resiliency Spotlight. Today we're gonna give you some examples on some exercises that you can do during this pandemic, where you can do it individually or you can do it with a partner. Here I got Staff Sergeant Thomas to my left and Staff Sergeant Lesh, who are going to demonstrate some exercises for you.
All right, so the first exercise we have is going to be push-ups. So your standard push-up you can do anywhere as long as you have enough space to lay down. So to get down, it's going to go down and up. And if you have a partner, you can do high five push-ups.
Notice these guys are using their mask as well as sanitizing their hands before and after the workout.
And that there's push-ups. The next exercise we have for you will be some air squats. So you just want to make sure you're standing there with feet shoulder width apart. You're just going to squat down, back up. And if you have a partner, you can also get a ball or any type of something you can pass between each other. And you're just going to squat down and pass it between them. And then the last exercise will be sit-ups. So you're just gonna wanna lay down. And you're gonna just go up, down. And if you have a partner, you can do the same thing with that ball. Face your partner and just pass it between each other.
So thank you again for allowing us to show you what you can do during this pandemic. We're really trying to hit on physical fitness resiliency. So these are things that you need to do and practice during this pandemic. And just as a reminder, the fitness center is open from 06 to 2000 Monday through Friday for active duty military, guard, and reserve on orders who are assigned or live on Peterson Air Force Base or Shreveport Air Force Base. Again, thank you.
Chief Jimmy Kelly. I was a young squadron commander and I hadn't had a chance to really work with a chief before, and he walked in one morning and he pulled something out of his pocket. And he put it on my desk and he says, "Sir," he goes, "you ought to take a look at this." He goes, "This ought to make you mad. Because it makes a lot of your airmen mad." And I picked it up and I looked at it. And I turned it around and I kept staring at it and looked around it and I said, "Chief, I ain't getting it. What are you trying to teach me here?" And he said, "Well, sir, read the box." And so I read it. It said, "Johnson & Johnson flesh-colored Band-Aids." And he says, "Yep." He goes, "Ought to make you mad because it makes a lot of your airmen mad." And I stared at that box and I kept turning it around and I put it around and I kept looking at it. I said, "Chief, I ain't getting it. What are you trying to teach me?" And he sort of had a little glimmer in his eye. He said, "Let me show you." And he pulled open a box, he ripped out a Band-Aid and he pulls it off and he puts his pink Band-Aid on his African-American skin and he says, "You know what?" He goes, "That ought to make you mad. It makes a lot of your airmen mad." And he winked and he walked out. What's the moral of the story as servant leaders? I could have stared at that thing for weeks. I would never have seen it. Because my life experiences, I've never actually been the only one of me in a room. Every time I've been in a room in my entire career, most of the people in that room look like me, sound like me. I've never been the only African American, Asian American, Hispanic American. I've never been in a room where perhaps I was scrutinized to a different level. I've never been the only woman in an organization who has everything I'm saying scrutinized to a completely different level. I've had people say things to me that they thought were funny, but that were actually sort of degrading. So how do we as servant leaders, how do we lead in that environment? I think the first thing we do is we acknowledge that we all have blinders on as leaders. And there are certain things that we are not going to be able to see in our organizations. And I think once we acknowledge that, we also have to acknowledge that there are flesh-colored Band-Aids in every squadron. It's going on. And so the only way we can see them is to surround ourselves and build our teams in ways that others can point them out for us.
Well, hello everyone. General Dave Goldfein and Chief Wright here, kicking off this Facebook. Let me start off by saying thanks to everyone who took the time to join us today, and especially Chief, thanks to you, not only for being a great wingman, but for just an incredibly important essay that you took the time to write to help educate all of us. So let me just sort of share maybe a couple minutes up front and then turn it over to the Chief. And then the way we're set up here is we have a team that's collecting questions as they come in. And so you'll hear a voice from Brooke who will give us the questions, and we're just going to keep going. We're scheduled for 2 hours because we wanted to make sure we spend enough time on this. There are three areas I would say lines of effort or focus that the Chief and I have going forward. First and foremost, we think it's so important that we take ownership of this issue. This is not a Minneapolis issue. This is an Air Force issue. And what goes on in the streets of America, we have to assume is all we know is going on to a certain extent inside our Air Force. We're not perfect. We have to get better. And the only way you get better is to take ownership of a problem. And so this is about the senior leadership of our Air Force taking ownership under the leadership, of course, of our great Secretary Barrett. Number two, this is about us showing by example how to have a tough dialogue that, quite frankly, it's often easier just to avoid it and sort of walk by it. And I think one of the opportunities that's been presented in this challenge is that we can't walk by this anymore. We got to have the difficult conversations that produces a greater understanding of each other inside of our Air Force, where we are a force of a profession of arms, where everybody matters, where everybody's valued, and everybody's background is important as we join this team. And the third area is, I would say, we acknowledge that at the end of the day, as military leaders, we'll be graded and judged not by our talk, but by our action. And we know that we're going to need to take meaningful action that produces long-term change that makes us better. It can't just be about talk, and it can't be something that any of us in the United States Air Force can assume is a quick fix. We didn't get here overnight. We are not going to recover or get better overnight. This is a commitment to a campaign, a long-term focused effort on better understanding of each other, better understanding of what some of our teammates have been living with their entire lives, and ensuring that we make the meaningful change that we have to as a profession of arms that the nation depends on in times of crisis. Chief.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, sir. Let me say thank you as well to everybody for joining with us today. And really, I wanted to say thanks for all of the overwhelming support the last few days from the piece I wrote. But I also want to thank the folks who communicated back to me that they didn't agree. I appreciate and can respect the differing opinions on some of the issues that we talked about in the piece. And I think this is the beginning of a dialogue. We won't all agree. We won't all see things the same way. We'll have different perspectives. But the important part, and what I would encourage everybody to do as we move forward, is create a space where people can talk. Create a space where your airmen, black, white, regardless of color, race, religion, where they feel comfortable talking to you about these tough issues. These are some really, really tough issues to talk about race. It doesn't matter if you're black or white. And it's incumbent upon all of us, certainly those of us in leadership positions, to create a space where people can feel comfortable talking about it. And one of the things I would encourage, particularly the commanders, command teams, folks in leadership positions to do is prepare yourself for a little bit of anger, for some sadness, for maybe even some rage. Don't be thrown off by the emotions that this might dig up that you may not see coming. Allow people to express themselves, to be who they are, to tell you how they see things, and hopefully, everybody can learn something in the process. That's why we're here today, is to try to learn from each one of you. We want to do a lot of listening today. We're prepared to answer whatever questions that we can, and just like we do when we do these at other times, we'll collect all of the questions that we don't get to, and we'll make sure that we get back to you on those. But really, one of the things that I asked for in the piece I wrote was your ideas, your responses to how you feel and what you think about this, and so this is the beginning of that process. Again, thank you guys for joining us, and we're going to turn it over to you to see what's on your mind, what questions you might have for us.
All right. Thanks, Jonathan. The first question we've gotten a lot of with this topic is, how do I really talk about being an ally with my airmen without being insensitive? A lot of it is around, how do I find the right thing to say? Like, what would you tell airmen around this topic?
Yeah, so I would say for airmen who might be feeling some kind of way about this and who need to express how they feel, just be honest. Just say what's on your mind. Say what you feel. Now, in order for, and then in turn, I would say to leadership, in order for airmen to be honest and to be transparent and say what they feel, you have to create the environment where they feel like they can do it. I know many folks have reached out to me, not just in the last couple of days, but throughout my time in the Air Force, and expressed that they don't feel like they can say how they really feel, that they'll be either unfairly judged or people don't want to hear it, or they make excuses. And so this is the time for leaders to put, your listening caps on and really fight to try to understand what people might be going through.
Yeah, Chief. And, one of the things that you and I heard a lot after the resiliency tactical pause was that the commanders that actually had the most effective sessions were the ones that actually shared a little bit of vulnerability, right? That actually, because, they look up, it's just so easy to look at us as leaders and think, well, gosh, everything's perfect up there, right? But in fact, all of us are human, right? We're all dealing with individuals. So part of creating a safe space, I think, is to share a little bit of vulnerability as a leader that allows someone else to say, really? Wow, so you're dealing with something. Guess what? Actually, I'm dealing with a bit of that too, right? Part of that vulnerability perhaps is also acknowledging, you and I have had this discussion a number of times. You and I grew up with different life experiences. almost every room I've ever walked into has been full of me. Mm-hmm. People that look like me, people that sound like me. Most of the systems in our Air Force have been designed by people like me, mm-hmm. for people like me. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I got blinders that are going to keep me from seeing what others with a different life experience and background are going to see immediately. Yeah. And it's not because I'm not trying to see it; I just can't see it. Right. It's just it's physically impossible because it's not part of my life experience. So part of, I think, creating that safe space is to sort of acknowledge that, hey, we all got blinders. Mm-hmm. I can't see what you see. And so the way we fill those blinders in is by opening and sharing and say, okay, Chief, what do you think about this? And tell me about what this was like for you growing up, just to increase that understanding.
Yeah, I would say we're close for lots of other reasons, but I think we're a good example because, as you mentioned, there are things that you might not see or understand about the experience of being Black or being a minority. But every opportunity that I've gotten to talk to you about it, to share either my thoughts or feelings or the experiences that our airmen might feel who don't, from a race standpoint, you've been all ears and receptive to, and here's I think some good advice for the leaders out there, because this is something that we all go through as leaders. You can't fix everything. Sometimes you just need to listen. Sometimes you just need, people just want to be heard, and they're not looking for you to fix things. They just want to be heard and at least understood, to make sure you understand their situation, their background, what things they may have been through, their experiences with authority or law enforcement or discrimination, exclusion, you name it. Sometimes they just want to be heard. And so don't think that when we're asking you to have these conversations, we're asking you to fix problems all the time.
Yeah. If there's one thing that I wish, an area that I'm always working on improving is being an aggressive listener. It's so easy at levels of leadership, right, where someone's talking, and if you don't focus in and make that person the most important person in the room, you ever want to stop the conversation? It's pretty easy as a leader. Just look at your watch once, right? What is that? What message does that send? Yeah. Right. So for leaders out there, if we're going to create, and this is leaders at all levels, this is flight commanders. I mean, these discussions that we need to have are going to be most effective at the smallest unit. Part of it. This is flight commander work. This is command team work to make sure we create these spaces for the discussion, and really be aggressive listeners. And to your point, it's okay for us not to have a clear understanding of a different life experience. And it's also absolutely okay for not us to walk in the conversation not having the answers.
Right.
Gentlemen, you talked a lot about the blinders and some of the opportunities that we have. A lot of our airmen are asking what resources that they might have to be more aware of their blinders, or to talk about it with folks that they might be scared to. What no-kidding resources are out there right now for airmen to work through this?
Yeah, so I would say probably the best resource for this particular topic to be able to talk about race are our EEO offices, our equal opportunity offices that specialize. So we have folks at every installation that specialize in this type of thing. Mostly they get used when someone has a complaint. I know they do a lot of outreach and try to educate people about things like unconscious bias and whatnot. But I would say that is the greatest resource that's available to our airmen and families. I would also think that the resources that are available through our military family life consultants and some of the other resources that aren't strictly designed to talk about racial issues, but are designed to help people with other spiritual and mental health concerns. I think those are always really good. Mm-hmm. And then frankly, we have lots of really good minority officers and associations on bases that can help you with understanding some of these challenges. I like to highlight the Minority Air Force Officers Associations, which is an incredible group of really, really sharp officers who come together and talk about these issues and make themselves available for mentorship and guidance. And they do a really good job of talking tough issues, mentoring, doing outreach, and things of that nature. So.
Yeah, Chief, the other thing is, that's one of the beauties of social media. There's not different forums where I think we can all. There's also a number of podcasts. There's great great forums where people debate these issues. But I'd offer everyone also this is a good time to think about who's in your brain trust, right? So what's a brain trust? When you face a situation and you want to call somebody and you can call that individual and actually show a little bit of vulnerability and share what you're thinking about, who's in that network? And if you haven't built that out, regardless of what level you are in the organization, now's a good time to start. Yeah. And it's when I was a young commander, I wanted to be known as being really decisive. As I matured over time, I decided I wanted to become known as someone who made good decisions. Mm-hmm. And that means sometimes you got to not feel like you got to make that decision all by yourself, right? And so you start building this brain trust, right? And if you get it right, the brain trust in that group that you build, that network you group, actually doesn't look like you, doesn't think like you, doesn't have the same life experiences, can fill in your gaps, can highlight where you have blinders, and you can call that individual to say, hey, listen, I'm facing this particular situation, and here's what I'm thinking about. Have you faced this before? Mm-hmm. And then over time, as you grow in the organization, that brain trust gets larger and larger. Yeah. Right, because other people introduce you to other folks. And so I would just share that the resources that you laid out are absolutely spot on, but there may be an opportunity for all of us to just sort of step back and ask, who do we go for advice, and how comfortable are we asking for advice? Or do we feel like we have to have all the answers by ourselves? Yeah,
and don't look past like the source. Don't look past if you work with minority airmen. Ask them, right? Ask them how they see the world. Ask them how they feel. Ask them what happens when they go outside the gate. Ask them how they get treated when they go in stores. Ask them if they feel like they're a part of the organization. If they deal with racism or exclusion, have they dealt with it in their past? I mean, sometimes there's no greater source to learn about what happens, things that the blind spots that you might have that you just don't think about to no fault of your own, than to just ask the people that you work with. And it is challenging, and sometimes they'll open up and sometimes they won't. Mostly I think it's going to be based on the level of trust and credibility that they have with you as a leader or a coworker or a colleague. But you can really discover some meaningful insights just from the people who live this experience every single day.
It might be, Chief, too, that's a part of our culture, our airman culture, that we can tap into, because we are in our service, for the most part. I know nothing's ever absolute, but for the most part, we do have a culture where, if Senior Airman Jones has a good idea, Colonel Jones or whoever should be absolutely not only open but want to sit down with Airman Jones and say, okay, well, tell me about that idea. Let's see if we can take action on it, right? Mm-hmm. So to your point of being able to create that safe space, we have a culture where those kinds of discussions can be less uncomfortable, perhaps, than an organization that's more hierarchical.
Yeah. Conversation being uncomfortable doesn't mean it's not necessary. I'll just say this so we can move on to the next question. But there are certain things that in our Air Force are taboo, right? We don't necessarily want you talking about politics, and we don't want you talking about religion and some of those other things in the workplaces. But race shouldn't be one of those taboo things, right? Mm-hmm. This is something that we should all be open and honest about and willing to talk about. Doesn't make it easy, doesn't make it comfortable, but I would say, especially given what's happening in our country today, it is absolutely necessary to have these conversations.
Yep. Amen.
All right, gentlemen. This one references a report that was recently released stating that the Air Force has the highest racial disparities in the military service branch for courts martial and non-judiciary punishments. What is your recommendation here and the way forward for administering discipline? A lot of our airmen are asking, do we now have to consider skin color when issuing disciplinary paperwork? How do we maintain objective standards and hold on to those who deviate from the standards accountable?
Yeah, I'll jump in to start. Chief, maybe jump in too. So, it's probably important. I asked as a prep for this town hall just to get some numbers, right? So here's the facts, right? This is straight data. Article 15s, 2.5 to 1 for drug abuse. Black airmen to white airmen, 2.5 to 1. Marijuana use. This is detected by random urinalysis, 4 to 1. Black to white. Failure to go, not showing to work on time, 2 to 1. All right, so that just gives you a sense. All right, so to me, here's the fundamental question. If I was to, when the chief and I go travel together, one of the questions I ask, I usually ask 2 questions when I talk to any airman, right? First question is, tell me your story. What brought you in? And I love listening to every airman's story on, where they came from, why they joined. And somewhere in there, they'll normally end with, and now I'm in this particular squadron, right, doing this, right? And then the follow-up question is, well, tell me, what does it mean to be a bulldog, right? If that's, or whatever carnivorous animal, right, is their mascot, right? So, and notice I didn't ask them, tell me what you do. I didn't ask them, how do you do it? I didn't ask them, what do you do it with? Be that, a toolbox or an aircraft or a missile, right, in nuclear business. I asked them a far deeper question, which is, what does it mean to be a member of your squadron? That speaks to the culture of the organization. And these numbers we got to take a hard look at, which is why the IG is doing an independent review, a deep dive review into our judicial system to make sure we understand what's going on. Armed with facts, we can then make some prudent choices on how to get after it in the way ahead. But there is a more important question than what happens after the act. And that is, in the answer to that question, what does it mean to be a bulldog? Does it mean that everyone in that team, everyone in that organization feels valued? Does it mean that the culture of being a bulldog embraces every member of that team and their family? Are they incentivized to behave in the right way because the organization embraces them and their family? Those are the harder questions that speaks to the essence of what it means to be part of that unit. And it's the command teams, the commander, the senior NCO, that volunteer lead spouse, that set the tone for the answer to that question. If we can get to the answer to that question right, I think that will help us drive these numbers in the right direction. We'll be far more informed when the IG gets done with their review.
Yeah. Chief. So I think it's important. I think the question asked, do we need to consider race when administering discipline, and how do we maintain standards? I think it's always important to consider everything about a person when you're trying to administer discipline or consider them for advancement or what have you. This idea that I don't see color, I think is a mistake that we as leaders make when we decide, hey, everybody's the same. I judge you based on these values and whatnot, and not see color. Because by not seeing color, you could certainly, by not seeing seeing sexual orientation, whatnot, you could actually miss some things that might be extremely important. But more than do you need to consider the race of the person, what you really need to consider is, what are my own biases? What are my own blind spots that I might not be seeing? So we didn't magically get to this point where African American males receive punishment at anywhere from 2 to 3 times the amount of their white male counterparts for the same offenses. So part of this is self-awareness on our part, understanding our own unconscious biases and asking the question, hey, am I giving this person a fair shot, the same as I would give any other person? And so this is not an easy. If this was easy, we'd pull out the magic dust, sprinkle it across the Air Force, and voila, we got it all fixed. So yes, you do need to consider race. You do need to consider background. You do need to consider the environment that you have either created directly or allowed that these airmen are attempting to thrive or maybe even just survive in. But most importantly, I would say you need to think about, hey, what are my own biases and how am I allowing them to affect the type of discipline that I administer? The challenging part, again, of this is not always easy because you don't always have a large sample size in your particular squadron. These statistics are spread across the entire United States Air Force. But I think for commanders and command teams as individuals, it's important to not just think about the race of the airman, but think about your own biases and how you administer discipline and if you're being fair, particularly comparative to their counterparts.
And Chief, you nailed it. I remember as a young squadron commander, actually telling others how proud I was that I was treating everybody fairly by being color, sexual orientation blind, right? So that, by God, I'm going to treat everybody the same way. It took me a little while to realize that actually that was inherently unfair. Mm-hmm. Because I was not taking into consideration that person's life experiences. Because part of my job as a commander was to create the environment where they could do their very best work, mm-hmm. right? Where they could thrive and their families could thrive. And if I didn't take the time to actually think about their background, their upbringing, and take the time to truly understand it, then I wouldn't be fair. I was being inherently unfair. So I think your point's spot on.
Yeah.
One of the comments that we received says, gentlemen, this has been an issue since I joined in 2003, or pick your year. This all seems so disingenuous. Why now? How are we to believe that people actually care about it now? And it's just, I feel like this is just going to be another item of interest until the hot topic dies down and then it's back to status quo. What do you want to tell someone who says that?
It could be. It could be if we let it. That choice is up to us. We could admire this problem, right? Do a Facebook town hall, right? Give a couple speeches and then get back to business as usual. Shame on us if we let that happen. This is on us, right? We're going to take ownership on this, and we know, Chief and I, that we will be graded based on whether we take meaningful action that moves the needle in a way that airmen see, right? Not just that we grade ourselves on. We will be graded by airmen and their families on whether we take meaningful action. And just to set expectations, we didn't get here overnight. We are not going to recover. This is a months-long campaign that we have got to get after. So could it be an attempt at a quick fix? If we let it, then shame on us if we do.
Yeah, no, I would just say, first and foremost, that's a very fair point. And I agree with the boss is we have to show you better than we can tell you. This is not something that's obviously, like you said, this has been happening for a while. This is not new. We've seen some of this data before. And, we honestly haven't done everything that we could be doing to fix this.
Every challenge in life you're presented has embedded in it an opportunity. And very often the bigger the challenge, the bigger the opportunity. What we're going through right now across the nation, if we were to take ownership of it, the way we intend to do, we're trying to do, presents an incredible opportunity for us to actually get better as an Air Force. But this is not going to be easy. If it was easy, it would have been done a long time ago. What we got to do is stay committed to it, and we're going to need everybody on this. Everybody that's out there that's passionate about this, that's passionate about our Air Force. That hey, look, the nation relies on us in times of crisis. The nation relies on its military. We remain a very well respected institution. It's on us, those of us serving today, to sustain that trust. And part of that is making sure that American parents who send us their sons and daughters and trust them to our care know that they are entering a profession that will value them, that will appreciate them, and that will understand them and their life experiences that they bring. And we're only as good as our airmen.
Gentlemen, one of the questions that we've gotten a couple of different ways is the Air Force considering having blind boards of sorts, meaning removing names from documents? This happens in the civilian world, and it helps to remove any unconscious bias. There can be an assumption of what race or gender someone is just by a person's name. Have we looked at that?
We actually have. The first time we heard about this was actually the way symphonies picked members. They found that if they were listening to a violinist and they could see that person, unconscious bias would kick in relative to who they chose. But if they could put that person behind a screen and just listen to the music, they would make much better choices. Army has looked at this, actually, in terms of how they select their select commanders. And so I sent General Kelly, the A1, and a team to go look at this for how we might bring that into the Air Force. They're completing their work right now, but I for one I'm absolutely open to that. I think there's a lot of things we might think about. So I'm pretty intrigued with what the Army's doing, and we are looking at it. I don't know right now in this particular session how we're going to incorporate it. I can just tell you that we are serious about looking.
Yeah, I spoke to General Kelly about this, our General Kelly, our A1, about this yesterday, and we had a pretty good conversation about the Army model and the team that we sent down, and how it might be able to work in our Office of Promotions, but also in our Chief Master Sergeant and our Command Chief Master Sergeant promotion process. So I actually like it. I don't think it's foolproof because there are some other indicators in the record, and whether it's a name or what have you, and potentially voice recognition. There's some other things that could allow people to know the race, gender, and whatnot. But generally, I really like this idea.
There's been some other ideas that have been out there about maybe a basic training questionnaire that might identify biases in the beginning, or are there things that we're looking at in the recruiting world that might assist with this as well? How do we make sure we select the right people with the right attitude?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I went through, so I forget where we were. We had one of our vans that Recruiting Command pulls in, and you go in and you actually log in to a computer and you answer a few questions, and then based on the answer to those questions, you get a colored band. And that colored band has got a computer chip on it, and you go into the van and you do this different activities, right? Some of them are hand-eye coordination, some of them are critical thinking skills, right? And at the end, the score is compiled, and it gives the recruiter a better sense of where you will most where you have the best chance of success. So I went through and actually got a chance to see whether I'd be recruitable, and I won't tell you whether I was or not. But one of the questions I asked the team afterwards was, because we value character so much as part of who we are as an institution, and this balance between character and competence, is there not a way for us to also look at character when it comes to, and some of this is the potential for an individual as part of our recruiting process, but also do it in a way that is not unintentionally biased based on how we craft the exercise. And so they're looking at it right now. I'm actually intrigued with a little bit broader look at young men and women who are considering joining Big Blue to ensure that we're looking at the right things in an unbiased way.
I just think we have to be really careful, and General Goldfein and I are probably two good examples. When we were being recruited to join the Air Force and U.S. Air Force Academy, we were teenagers. We were nowhere near the men that we are today, and while we weren't part of any hate group or racist or anything, there's probably other things in our character and the way we would have answered some of these questions and dealt with some of these questionnaires that might have given someone pause. So I like the idea. I just think we have to make sure that we don't end up ruling out really talented folks because of how they might see the world, which could be vastly different. When you're a young adolescent, 18, 19-year-old, most of how you see the world is kind of based on how you grew up and what you might have seen in the media on television. So I like the idea, but I just think we should be really careful.
Got it. Caution.
We discussed a couple of different ideas recently about maybe recruiting or records, names removed. One of the other questions that we got is we typically addressed tough issues like this with stand-down days. Are we looking at doing another stand-down day for this for organizations?
No, and it was considered. Chief and I talked about it, and we think that we came to the conclusion that there was too much risk that this would be considered by the force as check the square. That we're not going to solve this overnight, right? This is a long-term campaign, and we didn't want to give the impression that a tactical pause for a half day would be the solution. It could contribute by helping to create that space, but we want to leave that to commanders. Now, having said that, part of this session is for us to listen and get feedback. Mm-hmm. And, we'd love to hear from folks that if they felt like that would be something that would be of value to commanders there. And if so, as long as it's not a one and done, check the square approach, I'm certainly all ears.
Yeah, I put this in the category of, and I've been saying this for years, that every day is Wingman Day, right? Every day we should have the opportunity to talk about this. We shouldn't have to create a special day to talk about race or resilience or any of these things. I mean, I think it's incumbent upon commanders to create environments where airmen always feel like they can come to them, they could go to the first sergeant, they could go to their supervisor and have tough conversations about meaningful things that are important to them, to include this one when it comes to race. So I wasn't a fan of doing another RTP. I got a lot of feedback from the last one that some of the tactical pauses went well, but many of them didn't go so well. So I think we trust commanders to get after this, but we also realize that many of our command teams aren't necessarily equipped and comfortable having these conversations, and so that's why we wanted to come on today and talk about the importance of opening up and allowing space for airmen to talk about, especially to talk about their feelings about this topic. I just cannot. I know I sound like a broken record, but this is, I think, one of the most important things because what you're fighting for is understanding. You're not fighting to eliminate, racism or discrimination. I mean, that's a job for all of us. But what you're really fighting for as individual command teams is better understanding of not only your airmen but of yourself and how you see things.
There are some airmen who have commented that they feel like they can't talk about this on social media for fear of reprisal, or that they can't share their feelings because they might get punished about this. Yeah. What do you want to tell those airmen?
So I would say that space is no different than the space in the squadron, the space in the squadron break room, the space in the squadron's conference room, right? This is how airmen communicate these days. This is how they express themselves. So as long as they're being responsible, I think airmen should be able to express themselves on social media without fear of reprisal, without fear of being judged or treated a certain way. You know, I always say, hey, if my teammates decided, you know what, I'm just going to jump on social media and blurt out how I feel about race or any other topic, my immediate thought is not, well, hey, why did they do that? My immediate thought is, well, apparently I haven't created the right environment where they can say it to me or to our teammates. And so I tend to take responsibility for that. And so sometimes you might think that, you know, as a leader, you might think that, hey, I have an open door policy and people can talk to me about anything. But if they're not talking to you about anything, then that's some work that we all have to do. But I'm okay, and I think airmen should be free to express how they feel, and it's up to us to help them understand how to express their thoughts and feelings responsibly.
Yeah, and that we have put out some guidance to commanders to share across the wings, groups, squadrons, flights that can offer some thoughts on sort of the right left bookends on what's appropriate, right? Because we are a profession of arms, and so how we talk about these things is important. But I would say we're trying to set those bookends as wide as possible, right? Because it's more important that we have meaningful conversation, and as long as we keep that conversation respectful of all who may be in the conversation, I think we're on the pavement. I think when we start being disrespectful of members of the team in any way, shape, or form in this conversation is when we're probably off the tarmac on a dirt path.
Right. Just remember, right? This is tough stuff. This is, and be prepared for raw emotion. Be prepared to hear things that you might not like or agree with. That's what makes it so hard when airmen tell you that they feel a certain way, or they've been excluded, or they don't feel like a part of the team, or they face discrimination, or the reason that they respond to authority is because, you know, however they might have grown up and their experiences with you know, police officer or whatever it might be. I just think, you know, don't expect that this is a smooth, easy process, because if it was, then we wouldn't be here talking about it today.
Some of the earlier questions that we got was, can you elaborate or give an example of the Air Force system working for one and not for the other? In a personal way, I guess. You had mentioned in your video that, you know, the system was made for you and was by you and for you. You see a lot of you in the room. Can you talk a little bit about a time when that's personal? How that impacts you?
Yeah, Chief, you probably have more experiences with this than I do. I will tell you that, you know, just mine is pales in comparison to what many have faced. I will tell you that I was raised Jewish, and I remember at times when a Air Force chaplain would be offering a prayer, and it would be a Christian prayer or end in with a Christian prayer, and I immediately knew that I was excluded, that prayer was clearly not for me. So minor experience, but perhaps a little bit insight into what it looks like to feel excluded.
I think what the question might be alluding to is the idea that the majority of our leadership in the Air Force are white males, and the majority of the leadership who select leadership at other levels are white males, and so it's easy for a person like me, who looks like me, or who is not a white male, to look up at the leadership in the Air Force and at most wings, MAJCOM, numbered Air Forces, and whatnot, and not see someone who looks like them. We have the same challenge with females. We have the same challenge with our senior executive service, the most senior civilians in the Air Force, and so, you know, it's challenging sometimes as a minority. Other than when I was in high school, where I went to almost all high school, but every other part of my life, I've been a minority in everything that I've done. And I will admit that I think sometimes the exclusion that I felt was real. And sometimes I may have manufactured it. I can't get beyond this point that every time I didn't, not every time, but there were times when I didn't get selected for a job or I didn't get an opportunity. And I had to ask myself, was this because I was Black? Or was somebody more qualified and a better candidate? So over the years, I had to learn to check, myself, because you could easily get into a mindset and a mind frame where, you begin to think, if it happens so often, you begin to think like, oh, wow, they didn't pick me because I was Black, or he said this because I was Black. But you also, you can't become numb to it either. You can't become numb to the way people treat you when you go in store. You can't become numb to, things that as African Americans we deal with on a regular basis still to this day. Even as Chief Master of the Air Force, I still get followed up when I go in stores. I still get ignored in certain places if people might look at me, maybe the way that I'm dressed, or because I'm Black and think I don't have the money to shop in a particular store or what have you. So it's a fine balance between blaming everything on race and then just becoming so numb to it that you begin not to see it, and that's dangerous, not just for us in the minority, but it's dangerous for the folks that are in the majority as well.
Chief, one of the things I've seen too that I think we have to acknowledge here going forward is that we do have unconscious bias in the Air Force towards women,
Mm-hmm.
and especially women in leadership positions.
Mm-hmm.
You and I can be very decisive, bold leaders, and we will be given a completely different label than a woman who's a decisive, bold leader.
Absolutely.
And that plays out.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, part of this whole discussion is you start with acknowledging that, okay, we got an issue in our Air Force, we got to address it.
Mm-hmm.
I reached out to several women who are in industry leaders. Our CEO of Lockheed Martin, Marilyn Hewson, CEO of Boeing, Leanne Corrett, and asked them not only about their own experiences, but now that they'd risen to the top of a corporation or company, what are they doing to make it better within their company, and are there best practices that we now can emulate and bring into the Air Force? So we have a team that's working that across, not only at the high levels, but also now throughout the organization, because unconscious bias is there, it exists, it affects women in leadership roles, and we gotta own it, and we gotta make sure that we improve going forward.
One of the questions that we've seen is, I've been in the military this long, and I haven't seen racism. It hasn't impacted me. So what's really the big deal about that? What is like? A lot of people will lean towards showing the data. What would you tell someone who says it never happened to me, so it doesn't exist?
Yeah, I've never seen a Black mama, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? So there's lots of things that in life that I've never seen, but it doesn't mean they don't exist. And so if I'm being a bit facetious, but just because you haven't dealt with something, sometimes it means that you might not be paying attention, or you just haven't been in the space where it's happening. But it doesn't mean that it's not happening, and it doesn't mean that it's not actually happening right under your nose. And so sometimes when things like this come up, it would probably be beneficial for all of us to be a little bit more curious, to ask a few more questions, to try to really, really see, because sometimes, and I've actually had people write me in the last couple of days that said something very similar. Hey, I kind of wasn't paying attention. I didn't think this was a problem, but I sat down and talked to my airman today, and oh wow, I think I was missing the mark. So again, I would just say there's lots of things in life that we may have never seen and may have never dealt with, but it doesn't mean that they don't actually happen and they don't exist, and they don't exist right under our noses.
I'm a firm believer that no successful officer in the United States Air Force, certainly not anybody who gets these, gets there without being raised by those, right? By having NCOs that take a young officer under their wing and teaches them, and chiefs especially have this great code they use, when they're about to teach you something, and it normally starts with, "Hey, sir," or "Ma'am, you got a minute?" And if you know it's good for you, right, the answer is yes, absolutely, chief. And then you're about to learn something when that code, right, starts with, "Hey, with all due respect," right, you're about to learn something. So I was a young squadron commander, had my first chief, Chief Jimmy Kelly, one of just a spectacular leader who raised me in many ways. And he walked into my office one day and he put a box on my desk and he said, "Boy, this ought to make you mad because it makes a lot of your airmen mad." And I looked at it and I stared at it and I tried to figure out what he's talking about. I said, "Chief, I ain't getting it. What are you talking about here?" And he said, "Well, read the box." And I said, "Johnson & Johnson, flesh-colored Band-Aids." I looked at it and I stared at it and I said, "Man, Chief, I'm just not getting it. What are you trying to teach me here?" He said, "Let me show you." And he ripped the Band-Aid off, right? Put a pink, bright pink Band-Aid on African-American skin, right? Shone like a beacon. He said, "Yeah, that ought to make you mad because it makes a lot of your airmen mad." So the moral of the story, what he taught me was I couldn't see it.
Mm-hmm.
I just couldn't see it, right? Of course, to me, flesh-colored Band-Aids, right? What other color would they be,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, part of the question I think that someone's asking is, what if I haven't seen it? I would offer to you that maybe one of the answers to the question is you can't see it. It's just a blinder that we have. It's a flesh-colored Band-Aid in the organization, and the only way to get beyond that is to be to really dig into the issue by surrounding yourself with people who can fill in your blind spots and can offer you insight into things that you can't say because you haven't had the same life experiences. I think that's a lot of what this dialogue is all about.
Gentlemen, what kind of questions should we be asking our airmen? Like, what kind of powerful questions should we ask and be ready to listen to?
Yeah, so I don't think there's a script that we could pass along, but one powerful question that I think you can ask your airmen is, "Tell me how you feel. What have you been thinking the last couple of days? How is this impacting you? What's been your experience here in this unit? Do you believe that you have the same fair chance as your white male counterparts? You don't need a PhD in counseling to get to the root of some of these challenges." And then the most important part after you ask that question is you gotta be willing to listen. You gotta be willing to listen and accept, what you get, and what you get might be raw. It might be something that you may not be ready for. It may be something that leads, just like we are now, right? All of this leads right back to he and I, right? We are the leaders of the United States Air Force. And so what we're hearing, what we're seeing, we may not like it, we may not want it, but all of this stuff leads right back to we are supposed to fix this. And so don't try to be too fancy. Don't try to be too complex. Just imagine yourself in a situation where you feel excluded. You could potentially feel excluded. What questions would you want someone to ask? And some of those are, like I said, simple. Just, "Hey, what are you feeling? What are you going through?" And sometimes that can lead to discussions about backgrounds and growing up and experiences that might really, really have shaped people, and it might help you understand some of the anger, some of the anxiety, some of the stress, and some of the things that might lead to either good or bad behavior.
Chief, I don't know about you, but I've found too that the higher I go in rank and responsibility, the more staying power I have to have. if I'm going to have a meaningful conversation. Because the beginning of a conversation, depending on the distance and rank and responsibility, tends to always start rather shallow, right? And, hey, Airman, how you doing? Sir, I'm good, right? That's code for, sir, move along. I got work to do, right? And sometimes I found that I got to lean in a little bit and just say, no, I got nothing else going on here. I want to know how you doing? Tell me your story, man. What brought you in? What does it mean to be part of your organization? And when I walk out of here and you're talking to your airman fellow in the dorm, your buddies, whatever, your home, your family. I mean, and you look at each other. What are the things that really frustrate the hell out of you? Because I'm here to take taskers. My job is to make things better, remove obstacles, create the environment where you can do your best possible work, and so you can succeed and remain competitive. And so, what's getting in the way, and what's frustrating the heck out of you?
Let me give you the first question. I thought a little bit more about this. This is the first question you should ask, and it shouldn't be to your airmen. It should be to yourself. Have I created the environment where these airmen feel like they can actually talk to me? And that's a hard, honest question you need to ask yourself. And if the answer to that question is no, then before you can start asking how you feel and what you're going through and expect people to open up to you, you got to work on you and the environment and your leadership style and get yourself to a point where airmen trust you enough to be able to open up and talk to you about topics like this.
Yeah. And if you do nothing else, because this is sort of a learned skill. It becomes natural to some. It's unnatural for others. We're all introverts or extroverts. We like this. We don't like this. But if nothing else, as leaders, let's commit to being just really good listeners. Active, engaged listeners where we're squinting with our ears, we're leaning in, and that airman truly believes they're the most important person, not only in the room, but in the world for the time frame that you're there. And nothing is going to distract you from that conversation. If we start by being just really good listeners, that may be what opens up some of the space to have a good conversation. And it may not be just one conversation we're looking for, right? It's the beginning where you sort of set the tone and, folks want to really, can I really share something that's rather personal, that's rather vulnerable in this discussion? Hey, it may take about 2 or 3 times before that airman opens up. And so that's the investment we have got to make as leaders.
From the airman, how can we deal with the airmen who are being closed-minded to the situation and making jokes about it?
Well, creating a safe space also means allowing some humor as long as it's respectful of members of the team. Some of that humor, if it's respectful, could be entry into the dialogue, right? If it's disrespectful, then you're, again, as a leader, you gotta create the space where in whatever form, whether it be humor or not. If it's disrespectful of members of the team, any member of the team, then you have to take action and step in. There was a period in our history, we had come back from the Vietnam War, and there was a period in our history where it became rather commonplace to have fun in an exclusive way, where we were having fun at the expense of some members of our team. And I think that we understand that anything that's exclusive is not part of it doesn't fit with us. We are a big tent service, right? When young men and women think about what service they want to join, we want the young woman who says, I want to fly. And she's got to be able to look at the United States Air Force and see herself in us and in our culture. And the next person in line is, a young man who says, I love cyber, and I want to get into cyber, and I want to be solving hard problems early. And guess what? That's what we have to offer very often. because you're going to be solving really hard, wicked problems in the United States Air Force long before your civilian counterparts in Google or Microsoft or what have you. And so that person who wants to go in and get into the business of cyber operations got to look up and see themselves in us. And our culture has to embrace that person. And I could walk you through, maintainer, air battle manager, you name it. I could line up, right? And every one of those, what motivates that young man or woman to do that, to want to do that kind of work, starts with them seeing themselves in us and our culture embracing them. And so if we recognize that because of the diversity of our mission set, from leaflets to nukes, and from the 80 feet below the surface in the nuclear launch facility to the outer reaches of space, our mission set is so diverse that our culture ought to be embracing of the widest swath of America's youth as they want to come in and serve in the United States Air Force.
Closed-mindedness is a form of ignorance, to be honest. And one of the ways I think you deal with ignorance in the true sense, right? And I don't mean that in a demeaning manner, but if you're closed-minded about a topic, it means that you're unwilling to learn and be educated about it. So I would say three things that I would recommend for someone who might be closed-minded about this issue. Number one is education. Education. You have to educate them about the importance of diversity, about whether it's your history or their history or whatever it is that you want to get through to them. The second thing is perseverance, right? They don't want to hear it today, but guess what? Tomorrow I'll be talking about the same thing. And if you don't want to hear it tomorrow, guess what? Friday, I'll be talking about it again. And so you have to have some stick-to-itiveness, I would say, when it comes to educating people who don't want to be educated about a particular topic. And then the third thing, I think you have to throw some grace in that equation, because you could easily get frustrated when people don't want to hear your opinion, or if they are not as passionate about something that you think is important. And I would argue that this is extremely important. You have to be able to find grace and not get frustrated and not, fly off the handle and put them in a headlock and a chokehold and all that good stuff. But and realize, like the boss said, you can't change people's opinion overnight. Some of us have our opinions about race and diversity and discrimination and however we feel from the time we, could first walk and talk. And this issue that we're dealing with today in this nation and in our Air Force, for some, this won't be enough to change their opinion and thoughts about race and disparity and bias and discrimination and whatnot. But I think with constant education and being, persevering through it, and like I said, having some grace, people can change.
Chief, I was thinking about the last question about books, and I was reminded that we kicked off this week, Corona, with Simon Sinek, who recently completed a book called The Infinite Game. And so he helped us, all the leaders of the Air Force assembled. He really helped us think about, what kind of a game we're in, right? Whether it's a finite game where there's winners and losers, and how you think about that, and an infinite game where the ultimate objective is just sort of perpetuating your ability to stay in the game, and doing that through continuous self-improvement. And so I would offer to everybody here that Simon Sinek, Start With Why, Leaders Eat Last, and The Infinite Game are outstanding reads as well to help in this issue.
You had both sort of mentioned, having tough conversations, and that sometimes it might be uncomfortable, but how do you tell, one of the questions we got was, how do you tell someone that they're biased or prejudiced without feeling attacked, without making them feel attacked or hurting their feelings too?
Yeah, so I think, you should stick to the facts and how you feel, right? So I don't know that I could tell someone that, hey, you're biased or you're prejudiced, or but I can tell you how I feel. I can tell you how what you've done, the environment that you've created, makes me feel. This is when you say this, or when you do this, when you don't include me, or when you call me this name, or when you discount my opinion in front of others, when you show these racially charged cartoons, or this is how I feel, and this is how other airmen around us feel. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be offended. I mean, that's typical, right? That happens to all of us. When my wife tells me I didn't take out the garbage or wash the dishes, it's fact, and I get offended sometimes. So, I would say in terms of how we communicate with each other, as a leader, you need to be willing to hear the tough feedback. And as a communicator, I think it's important to stick to, hey, this is what happened and this is how it made me feel. Now, some people will cringe at this, hey, we're airmen, we're warriors, we're tough, and we don't supposed to talk about our feelings. Absolutely, you should talk about your feelings, because that's the one thing that you can validate. I can't validate what was in your mind. I can't validate what you meant when you said it, but I can validate that, hey, this is how I felt and what went through my mind and through my heart and through my stomach when you said or did this. I think that's a good start to a conversation that sometimes it could lead to a couple of different outcomes. One is, I didn't realize that I was making you feel that way. I'm going to do my best to work on it. Or in some cases, and I've seen this, and many of you might not be surprised by a response that's something like, no, you shouldn't feel that way, because I didn't mean that. You can't tell me that I made you feel this way. Again, where you need some education, some grace, some perseverance, to patience to stick to that conversation. But I would say in general, stick to what the person did and how you actually feel about it.
I'll offer it, and this is more directed towards more senior leaders, right? Maybe group, wing commanders, chief master sergeants, those that have been in the business for a little while. I had the privilege as a young major of being an aide-de-camp for a guy named General Mike Ryan. He was the commander at AF South in Naples, Italy at the time. And he told me once, he said, he goes, I can tell usually within about 5-10 minutes of arriving at a base how things are going. He said, it's just a feeling I get. He said, it's the sideward glances of the senior NCOs. It's this overall tension that you can feel in an organization. And he said, and normally I spend the rest of my time just validating what my initial instincts were when I stepped into this organization. I share that story with you because our gut instincts sometimes are a great guide on what's going on in an organization. And for senior leaders who, especially, maybe you're responsible for portions of the organization that are not geographically located with you and you just got a period of a visit, I would offer to you that where there's smoke, there's fire, right? If your initial gut instinct causes you to just question, there's some tension here. I'm not sure why, but there's just some tension here in the organization. Take the time to dig a little bit and find out. And it might be that the tension could be racially based. It could be, it could not be. Maybe it's not the commander. Maybe it's someone else in the organization. But there's normally something going on, and if you walk by it, you bless it. And so I would just offer too that sometimes as you get older in the organization, our gut instincts can be a very powerful tool for us to use and to refine relative to what might be going on in an organization.
One of the other questions that we got in is civilians are experiencing the same racial discrimination in the Air Force. Will there be some sort of do civilians have a place in this conversation? And are we doing anything to address that side of the house as well?
Yeah, our Air Force is active Guard Reserve civilian families. And the deep review that the IG is going to go out and look at is not active duty only. It's active, it's guard, it's reserve, it's civilian. And so we have to look at our entire institution as we go forward, or we're going to miss. We're going to miss on what comes back, and we're going to miss on whatever steps that we and the leaders of the Air Force decide to take going forward if we exclude any group to include civilians.
Yeah, so same thing, right? This is at the core of this issue is communication and behavior between human beings, regardless of your rank or status. And so our civilian airmen deserve the same level of respect and the same opportunity to excel as any other airman. And I would expect that for them to have the same tough conversations with their civilian bosses or their active duty bosses or whatever component the leaders in their organizations whatever capacity they might serve in. So yes, this is for everyone.
One of the other questions we got from an airman was at the ROTC level. What's the correct course of actions for cadets to take? So they were just wondering where they were in this conversation.
You know, there's a balance that we all have to achieve between character, competence, and reputation. Now, when I tell young cadets, when I tell young students, when I tell those who are aspiring to join the Air Force, those that are young in the Air Force, is first and foremost, it starts with character. And if you aspire to leadership position, our airmen are way too smart. They are wicked smart. They'll see through a say-do gap in a leader in a second. Unless you got an Oscar, on your shelf for great acting, they're going to see right through you. Character is who we are. It's the core of our being. It's how we define ourselves and our family. It's decisions we make when no one's watching. Reputation is what people think about us over time after they've watched us for a period of time. If we focus on the first, the second will take care of itself. But the reverse is not always true. And so, first and foremost, for a young man or woman in ROTC, I would say commit yourself to a journey towards impeccable character. And I emphasize journey because I don't think you ever arrive. I'm still working on mine, right? And so that becomes the secret sauce for success in anything you choose to do, be it the Air Force or anything else. And then the competence piece is about committing yourself to being the very best you can be at whatever it is that the nation asks you to do. It may be what you wanted to do when you came in the Air Force. It may be something that wasn't even on your radar when you came in. Regardless of what it is, be the very best. Because if you establish that reputation early in your career at being competent, capable, a go-to airman, all doors are open to you. So that balance between character, competence, and reputation, I think, is really important for a young person, regardless of where they are.
Yeah, so I would say the same thing, right? Whether you're at USAFA and they specifically asked about ROTC. So if you're a cadet in one of our many ROTC programs across this nation and you feel disenfranchised or discriminated against, or you want to have this conversation, just like we would encourage anybody else, start with your detachment leadership. Start with the student leadership, the leader in your detachment and the detachment commander. And in many cases, you will have other outlets through the actual school that you might be attending, and then ultimately the resources at the home center who own all of our ROTC detachments. But and then if you're a detachment commander, I think it's up to you to make sure that the cadets in your respective space understand, hey, if you have an issue, this is who you should be talking to. If you have a concern about whether it's, equality or race or harassment, whatever it might be, here are the outlets that you have. Here are the resources that are available to you. I think we owe that to the young men and women that we're going to ask to come into the Air Force and be leaders.
Chief, might be worth talking for a minute about mentors and mentoring, because Secretary Wilson taught me a lot of things. She taught me this one. She said, if you ask a young man, when were you interested in joining the Air Force? So normally, on average, I will say about somewhere between 12 and 15 years old. She says when you ask the same question of a young woman, it's several years later.
Yeah.
If you ask a young man, well, tell me, who's your mentor and how many mentors do you have? 75% of young men will tell you who that mentor is. 25% of women will name who their mentor is. And so there's a couple of things that come out of that. Number one, searching out and getting and asking someone to be a mentor early is important for all of us. And it's important for all of us to acknowledge that we have to mentor to many who don't look or sound like us.
So I think it's extremely important. Growing up, I had mentors, some who looked like me and some who didn't, some who were male, some who were female. I did have mentors that I needed, who were black males, who I needed help from understanding the challenges that I was going through as a young African American male. But again, a lot of my mentors I have white female mentors, I had white male mentors and whatnot. And so subsequently, when I got to the point where I was an NCO and felt like that I had what it took to be mentors, to be a mentor, it's just spanned I've been a mentor for and continue to be a mentor for folks from all walks of life and all career fields. The other thing I think I want people to get away from is believing there is value in having, if you're a pilot, having a pilot mentor, if you're a maintainer, if you're a personnelist, having a mentor in your career field. But there's a ton of value in reaching outside of your specific specialty and asking someone for help. And this is not difficult. This is not that difficult either. On occasion, someone has come up to me and said, "Hey, Chief, will you be my mentor?" And it was very formal, kind of like that, or they just assigned me as their mentor. But mostly, they would say, "Hey, do you got time for a coffee?" Or "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" Or "Can I send you an email?" Which turned into a second cup of coffee, which turned into an email exchange, which turned into a book recommendation, and then a full-blown mentoring relationship. So sometimes it's just you see somebody you admire, you see someone you think may be able to help you with whatever situation that you might have. And when you're in trouble, that is a time to look for a mentor. But I think a better time to look for a mentor is as you're trying to figure out what is it I want to be in life, in the Air Force, what goals do I have? Let me find somebody that's successful and see if I can emulate and learn something from it. And I would say most leaders get really, really excited when folks come up to us and are looking for some help and some guidance, and we get the opportunity to pass along, the blueprint. That's kind of my theory and philosophy behind the blueprint leadership concept is, hey, I've enjoyed some success in our Air Force, and I want to pass along the blueprints to each and every one of you.
Another question that we got from someone was from a key spouse perspective. They wanted to know how we can take care of those who are scared, especially if their spouse is deployed during some of this unrest. What do you want to share with the families and the spouses?
Yeah, I'll start off by just saying, first of all, thank you to anyone here on this town hall that's a key spouse. Absolutely critical part of our Air Force, and they do so much for us at every level of the organization. And most of what we've talked about today, in terms of tools, tips, advice, thoughts we've offered, I think actually applies equally to spouses. I can't think of one thing we talked about today that wouldn't apply to a spouse who's also trying to create that space for either another spouse or family member to be able to have the kind of conversations that we're having today. It's so important in our culture, and we don't have it 100% right, but it's so important part of our culture that we acknowledge our sacred duty as leaders, there's so many things we try to get right, but there's one thing that we have to get it right every single day, and that is that every airman who's sent into harm's way is properly organized, properly trained, properly equipped, and courageously and inspirationally led to get the mission done that we ask them to do. And when they come home to their families, we've taken care of them while they're gone. That defines us as an institution. That no spouse goes through a deployment alone, no spouse and family goes through a tough situation alone. That we are a family in terms of how we take care of each other. Our spouses exhibit a very special kind of courage when they endure the long hours, the hardships, the separations, and something that I don't think we talk about enough often, which is the loneliness that can come with being married to a military member in a nation at war.
I was just going to say, I think our spouses sometimes can teach us how to do it. We were just at Minot, and we were talking to the key spouses and how they have responded to COVID and operating during COVID. I think it was probably some of the most innovative and creative stuff, and they were more connected than actually some of the units on base. And again, this is where when you talk about creating this environment, I'll go right back to command teams in this environment. You create. Spouses are a part of that, and so if you have spouses in your spouses and families in your formation, and spouses especially, and I think we all do a good job of. We should be doing a good job of taking care of the spouses of our deployed airmen. This is the time that someone should be checking in on them. This is the time that we should be creating spaces, whether it's virtually or whatever means that we're using these days, to allow them to express themselves. Because oftentimes, here's why I think this is, I'm glad we brought this up, because oftentimes they can tell you, the active duty, the military member might not want to talk about the heartache, the pain, the despair, the anxiety that they go through when dealing with race and discrimination. But the spouse might be willing to say, hey, let me just tell you how beat my husband or my wife is when she comes home after being in this environment. Let me tell you how much stress it causes on our family because he or she does not understand how to deal with this situation. So our spouses can be really, really important resources in helping us have this discussion. You just have to open up the door and allow them to be a part of it.
Yeah, I worry, Chief, sometimes. I wouldn't say worry. I think a lot about our Air National Guardsmen in this regard, because for active duty, normally you're associated with some kind of main operating base. There's a community there, and there's sort of there's somewhat of a support system built into life in the Air Force. For an Air National Guardsman who is not associated with the main operating base or may commute to work as a traditional guardsman or reservist, the experiences that you have on duty, you have less of that network perhaps when you go back home to a city that may be significant distance away from the base. And I just think we've got to make sure we recognize that as a key part of our force, and always look at creative ways of connecting, right? So that no spouse out there or no family member feels like they're all alone on their own as they go through what are tough times. And we're normally on these kind of a session always going to focus on the negative, but there's also a lot of positive that we ought to acknowledge. That I know, at least for me and Dawn, at each time in our career we thought, okay, this is time, we're about ready to transition, we'll try something new. One of the things that has kept us in all this time is that sense of family, that sense of belonging that we just never felt like we would really get on the outside. That's just a part of the culture of the Air Force, and I hope that I hope we always keep that as a foundation of who we are, and that across the organization we acknowledge all the things we've been talking about in terms of racial bias and how we treat and deal with others, and we're extending that same kind of conversation to our families as well. Yeah.
So some of the challenges, I would say, boss, is that sense of belonging that you and Dawn feel is not always as easy for some of the airmen that we're talking about here. When you have this exclusion and biases and some of the things that we talk about.
Yep, very point.
Another question we got from an airman was, what are you doing about recruiting Black airmen to create diversity? Numbers don't lie. Look at the demographics.
Yeah, so we're in some areas we're seeing some meaningful progress. We're seeing reasonable progress in our young enlisted ranks. I would say that we can get better, and we need to get better. More than anything, a young African American, has got to look at the Air Force and see themselves in us, and we have got to have the culture that embraces them and makes them feel like that we're inclusive, that they belong, right, and that we are respectful of their background, their upbringing, and what they bring to the team. That is a journey. I'm not sure that's actually a destination. I think we just keep working on that day after day after day. So I would just say we are making some progress. I think, I don't know the exact numbers, we could probably get it and post it, but entering class of the Air Force Academy, I think it's almost 50% non-white in terms of diversity. This has been, so we're making progress. We're focused on it. I think that this situation that we're in now and this dialogue can help us accelerate and be even better.
Yeah, so I think we probably need to do a better job in recruiting from some of our historically Black colleges and universities and some of the areas in the United States where Black people grow up. Certainly, and I think we can do a better job of finding those airmen that want to come into the Air Force through, we talked earlier about the ROTC programs. So much work to be done, I think, in this area of recruiting minority airmen period. But I will say that I think we can do a better job as an Air Force in recruiting from areas that are where minorities reside and taking advantage of the historically Black colleges and universities and finding those folks who want to join our team.
Part of the having a really honest, tough conversation, Chief. One of the things that we're not doing well at is recruiting African American, Hispanic, Asian American women into our operational career fields. Mm-hmm. Right. So right now, for instance, our pilot force is relatively non-diverse, and it's a known problem.
Right.
And so one of the things that we're doing is we put a fairly significant amount of money. I want to put some more into junior OTC and Civil Air Patrol to incentivize getting young men and women in the air, and hopefully sort of sparking a little bit of a fire and of interest in flying and a flying career in the United States Air Force by getting them airborne. And then because we are the descendants of the Tuskegee Airmen, and flying is a big part of who we are. And so that's an area that we're not doing well at, quite frankly, and we have got to get better.
I agree.
Christopher asked, I think, Chief, right, this is you. Can you explain what you meant by, because I'm not Black, I don't know? I want airmen to feel comfortable with communicating their issues with me, and just because I'm not Black doesn't mean I can't understand.
Yeah, so in the piece I wrote, this was centered around trying to understand what Black people may have been through in their lives and what they go through every day. And I've had several conversations, and I've talked to people who think that, I kind of know what you go through because I'm Asian, or because I'm female, or because I was the only person in this squadron who was this or that. Unless you live this experience, you don't know. And so in order to understand it, you got to be open, and you got to be willing to allow people to talk to you about it. the point of that part of the op-ed was don't just assume that you know what it's like. Even if you grew up in a black neighborhood, even if you have a black spouse or what have you, what I was really kind of getting to was don't assume that you know, but be open and allow people to talk to you about the experiences that they have.
Never stop trying to understand, right? Searching for that understanding and greater meaning in terms of how we lead.
Jason asked, what can we expect the Air Force to do in the next 3, 6, 9 months to establish the right type of culture for our force?
Yeah, so Jason, the first thing we're doing, of course, is reaching out the way we are today and acknowledging that we have a problem in our Air Force, that this is not about Minneapolis, this is about the Air Force, and taking ownership of that as leaders of the institution, and then committing to a campaign to get better in an area that we are falling short in. There is no one thing that we're going to do. Quite frankly, there's not even 3 things that we're going to do. There's going to be a series of things that we've got to do. We've got to listen. We've got to see what the IG comes back with in terms of the deep dive review that they'll do in 2 tranches, right? The first one was going to look at the most immediate issue, which is our Uniform Code of Military Justice, disparate percentage of UCMJ actions, African American versus white counterpart. So we're going to dig into that. And then we're going to take a look at officer and NCO talent management. And do we have barriers in place that are intentional, unintentional, right? How do we go out there, swim with our ears, and take a look at how we are, it's the full, life of an airman, right? From how are we doing initial recruiting, where are we spending our recruiting dollars, who are we reaching out to how are we handling basic military training, BMT, from BMT to tech school to the first term airman's course to into the squadron, right? It's the full life cycle. How are we doing in that mid career point in terms of retaining? That tends to be, quite frankly, where most women, if we're going to keep them in the Air Force for a career, they're going to make that decision at about the mid-career point. What are we doing there to increase the incentives for a woman to stay in our Air Force? All the way through. So, boy, if we try doing 1 or 2 things and think that we're going to get better, I think I don't think we're taking this seriously.
Yeah, I don't think there are some policy and programmatic things that we have to do, right? So this deep dive will help us. We got to think more about how we get more minorities into positions of leadership. We've talked about the bringing in some outside help from a diversity standpoint. So there are some things that we can do. But what I would love to see is that because we start having these conversations, because people get more comfortable talking about race and leaders gain better understanding about race and disparity, because people start paying more attention and they understand their gaps and their biases. And some of that will be, a lot of that I think will be through having healthy conversations. Some of it will be training. We can send you to training and teach you about unconscious bias and whatnot. But I think most of this discovery will happen through these conversations that we are encouraging. Then our body, the Air Force as a body, will begin to heal itself. We'll provide the medicine through policy and these reviews and holding commanders accountable for being fair and equal, and we'll hold ourselves accountable for making sure we get more minorities in aviation and some of the things that the boss mentioned. But we can heal ourselves a bit by being open and having these conversations that will lead to understanding, that will lead to less bias, that will lead to less exclusion and things of that nature. So I think it's a combination of things. And so part of our responsibility is how do we keep this conversation going beyond next week? Because like many things, this is important to a lot of people right now. I don't know how important it'll be to everybody that's on this feed, and even to I can tell you it'll remain important to he and I, but we have to make sure that we keep this conversation going, that we keep people focused on this, that this is something that people think about every day, not just when there's a crisis, not just when something happens on the news. That'll be a really important part of how we fix this is how do we normalize this? How do we normalize, like we've been trying to normalize talking about suicide and resilience for a long time? How do we normalize this idea that we should be able to talk about and express our feelings about race, whether you're black or white?
It goes to our three, in the opening of this, we decided that there were three areas we're going to focus on, right? One, taking ownership. Number two, having a tough dialogue, creating a space for that dialogue. But the third piece is taking meaningful action. Mm-hmm. And we acknowledge that if we're going to make the institution better, that it's going to be the actions that we take on top of the words that is how we will be graded. Mm-hmm. And we actually acknowledge that and are ready to get after it. But we're going to do that based on thoughtful dialogue across the force, making sure that we understand the analysis that goes into it, so we're taking steps in the right direction. We haven't talked, Chief. We talked a little bit about role models, but I think that's an area where also we've talked about taking some meaningful action. I learned this as a young father of two daughters, and I remember being in a fast food restaurant, Luke Air Force Base, going through F-16 training, and my oldest daughter was with me in line, and there were some pilots that were in line, that were in training, women. And I remember my daughter looking at me. She goes, "What are they doing, Dad? Why are they wearing flight suits?" I said, "Well, they're training to be F-16 pilots. They're in training with me." And she looked at me. She says, "You mean a girl can be an F-16 pilot?" I says, "Absolutely." I said, "Remember, I've told you can do it. There's nothing you can't do." So there was a great lesson for me as a dad that, I could keep telling her that, but until she saw it, it really had very little meaning. Because everything what she was hearing from her dad was not reinforced by anything she was ever seeing. Mm-hmm. She had to see it. And so that's the power of role models that we have in our force, and we need to increase that.
Yeah. We don't have enough. We don't, and I'll say specifically, I think we're doing okay. We can always do better in the highest enlisted ranks, but we certainly don't have enough minority and female role models in the senior officer ranks, and so hopefully that's one of the areas that we can really improve. And I don't think we can improve in that area in the next 3, 6, 9 months, but it's something that as we bring in a chief diversity officer, that's a strategy that we can build to improve this over the years.
Yeah, amen.
Gentlemen, as we get ready to sort of wrap this up, I wanted to share that we've gotten a lot of gratitude for your leadership. A lot of folks reaching out, telling you thank you for leading the way on this topic and being open to this conversation. Is there anything else that we didn't ask or that you didn't get asked that you want to talk about before we?
I'll start and then I'll let the boss finish. Okay, I just want to make sure people understand that. I think it's important for us as leaders when we have a specific issue to address that issue. My passion for what's happening in this country and my passion for what is happening to our young black male airmen does not mean in any way, shape, or form that I'm not concerned or I don't care about all of our airmen. Of all races, and I think I have a pretty documented history of taking care of all airmen. But in this particular case, and the best analogy I've heard is that, hey, if the fire department drives into a neighborhood and a house is on fire, all the houses in the neighborhood are important, but they shouldn't go and spray water on every house. They should deal with the one that's actually on fire. And in this case, the lives and the careers and the feelings of our Black airmen are the ones that are on fire that we need to deal with. Again, it doesn't mean that we don't care about all of our airmen, and because I think everyone, if they really know who we are as individuals and who we are as a leadership team, we do. But we do need to deal directly with this specific issue. And again, I just want to say thank you for the support. I really appreciate the feedback, both the good and the feedback that doesn't necessarily agree with how I see life. I appreciate all of it. And as always, man, I'm proud to serve. I'm proud to call myself your chief. So thank you.
I went to a Reagan forum, I think it was last year, and it's a gathering of senior defense leaders, industry, government. And one of the panel sessions they had was with Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. And the question they asked me, I said, so tell us, why do you think the military still remains one of the most respected institutions in America? And I'll never forget, he said, he goes, you all do hard things really well, over and over again. And the American people have come to expect that you do hard things well. This conversation is a hard thing that we have to do well. And if we're going to do it well, it means we're going to stay committed to it across the Air Force, every airman. There is no bystander in this one. We're all in this one together. And we've got to commit ourselves to listening, to understanding, and to taking meaningful action that moves the needle in ways that our airmen see and recognize as we get better as an institution. And so I couldn't be prouder to serve with this chief on this journey. And I want to just thank everyone for taking the time to join in.
Thank you, David.
All right. Booyah.
Booyah.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you.
They fight to liberate. They fight to let justice arise and tolerance and goodwill among all thy people.
It was the deep knowledge, and pray God we have not lost it, that there is a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest.
Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogances. Lead us to the saving of our country, and with our sister nations into a world unity that will spell a sure peace.
Tranquility Base. Eagle is at Tranquility, over.
Fantastic.
Top reset. And we're getting a picture on the TV.
Today, we have programs to try to get people interested in science.
Why do you have programs trying to get people into? Because there's nothing out there that's otherwise attracting them. You didn't need programs in the 1960s to stimulate interest in science. Apollo was doing that. There is no force as powerful on our hearts and minds as dreams of space.
He is an Air Force colonel and flight test engineer who was selected as an astronaut in 2000.
And I say this not as an astrophysicist. I say this as a citizen of a country that has at one time and continues to value innovation and what role that plays in exploration. When we discover a black hole or a new planet or there's an eclipse, it is headlines. It's headlines because everybody looks up and everybody wonders, who am I? What is my place in this universe? And what I'm saying is space is a force unto itself to inspire people to want to go into sciences in the first place. And this is not my imagination, this is real. So, if you inspire a generation to go into STEM fields, these are the fields that assure a thriving economy in the future, because the growth economies of the future will pivot on innovations in science and technology that feed them. So, I would say a vibrant space program led by the government, making the first investment where then private enterprise can and often does take it up afterwards when the risks are quantified, will completely transform not only our country but all of civilization. Because science literacy will be a fundamental part of what it is to be a participant in our civilization. It's a culture that we would lead to.
As summer approaches, the last Friday of May is National Heat Awareness Day. With the season fun at hand, there are ways to avoid summer danger. Stay hydrated. Loss of moisture due to sweating can deplete the body's water supply. Use sunblock and appropriate clothing to prevent painful and risky sunburns. Keep your children and pets safe by not leaving them in the car, even for a short period of time. If you're working outside, take your breaks in the shade. And remember, keep hydrated, wear sun protection, and most importantly, use common sense to keep your summer safe and fun.
With your look around the Air Force, I'm Angel Orozco. Racial tensions and current events in America are having an impact on airmen, so General David Goldfein, Air Force Chief of Staff, and Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, Khalith Wright, recently sat down to discuss.
My greatest fear is not for myself, is that I'll wake up one day and one of our airmen will be George Floyd or Tamir Rice or you Philando Castile, you name the person. So it's been tough, but I also realized that one, it's okay for us to be angry. It's okay for me to be angry, but at some point I then have to decide, okay, what next and what should we be doing about it? What conversations should we be having? I realize race is a tough conversation for a lot of us, for a lot of our commanders out in the field.
The two leaders also addressed the need for leadership at the wing, squadron, and unit levels to create a safe space for discussion and greater understanding of what minority members go through. Chief Wright posted a message on social media to all airmen addressing the recent events, while General Goldfein shared a letter he wrote to commanders on his social media accounts. The Air Force song has some new lyrics. General Goldfein announced earlier this year a two-step process to update the song to better capture diversity in the Air Force during its 73-year history. The first update was back in March. General Goldfein says the song's new lyrics add proper respect and recognition to everyone who serves and who has served. The service says the changes are subtle but more accurately illustrate the role women have played for decades. The full lyrics can be found on the af.mil website. And that's your look around the Air Force.